Yes, we are recording. Happy Open Access Week to everyone. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us this morning. My name is Chris Hollister, and I am Head of Scholarly Communication with the UB Libraries. My colleague, Mark McBride, and I planned this event to coincide with Open Access Week. But more importantly, it was our intent to advance the discourse on open access publishing, open scholarship, and open science beyond the surface level, sort of open is cool kinds of conversations that we commonly encounter in this space. We want to facilitate substantive conversation that gets all of us thinking about making real progress in the area of open scholarship. And that is why we solicited the remarkable folks who were on today's panel, and Mark will introduce you to them in just a moment. But first, a couple of quick housekeeping issues. We are, as you know, recording this event, and the recording will be posted on the SUNY Center for Professional Development's YouTube channel, and a direct link will be posted on the center's website. We anticipate that with these compelling panelists and our exceptional moderator, that the conversation will take on a life of its own. But if you have questions for our panelists, please wait until all of them have given their initial presentations. Mark and I will monitor the chat feature, and we'll try our best to have all of your questions addressed in the time that we have. So once again, thanks very much for being here. And I'm now handing this over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Mark McBride.
Chris, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Mark McBride. My pronouns are he, him. First, I want to thank Chris, especially for his leadership and his vision to help pull this thing together. It started as a conversation, and then, through Chris's efforts, it really got the ball rolling. So kudos to you, my friend. And I think many of us who are here today, we believe open access is an important issue for faculty researchers, as well as the university, and really all stakeholders in the research enterprise, including libraries. But at stake here is much more than a simple access to academic journal articles issue. There's a bigger picture here, and that picture is a global one. We start to ground ourselves in some of the issues we're dealing with today. A commitment to open science, it helped our society, it helped our world to quickly develop a vaccine to help stop the spread of the novel coronavirus. Open access to scientific information, to data, to research output, to the general population, that was the tip of the spear for that broader exploration of research methodology and findings among all the stakeholders, and it really resulted in saving lives. But full access to scholarly outputs from our top researchers, it's still an issue for a number of universities, publishers, and our researchers who still have to grapple with this. So today, we assembled 5 distinct voices that are going to discuss this issue with us. They're going to talk about open access, the role and the impact it plays in their professional lives, and share their vision, their ideas, and their experiences. We are joined today by Evviva Weinraub Lajoie, who's the Associate Vice Provost for University Libraries at the University of Buffalo. We have Dr. Diana Aga, the Henry M. Woodburn Chair and Professor, UB Department of Chemistry. Dr. Jeff Good, Professor and Chair, UB Department of Linguistics at UB. And Gemma Hersh, whose previous title was Vice President of Open Science at Elsevier. I know that title's been shifting around lately, so Gemma, I might have you take a crack at your fresh title. When our provost, Shadi Porus-Hadvik, was going to be here, she had a last-minute scheduling conflict. She couldn't be here. She sends her regards. This is an issue that's of importance to her, and she was really excited to be part of this conversation today because she truly believes in open access. And if you look at her scholarly record, you'll see her impact in that space. She offers her serious apologies and her regrets. But for today, we also brought in a colleague from Ithaca SNR to help really ground the discussion and kind of facilitate the discussion amongst our panelists today. And it's our colleague and my friend, Dr. Danielle Cooper from Ithaca SNR. Ithaca and Danielle in particularly research the publishing landscape while helping the scholarly community understand and distill complex issues related to libraries and academic innovation and again, scholarly communication. Danielle is one of the experts in the field here. So we brought her in today to have this conversation. When Danielle speaks, I always give her my full attention because she's typically one of the smarter people in the room, if not the smartest. So I welcome you to do the same. Without further ado, my colleague, Dr. Danielle Cooper.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much to Mark and Chris, especially for organizing the session, to our panelists for contributing, and to everybody today for attending and making the time for this. It's almost hard to go after that kind of introduction from Mark. I feel kind of humbled, I will admit. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about an issue that I think is, the issue that we're facing in higher education right now, especially when it comes to issues related to information technology and access in general. As Mark explained, I come from a not-for-profit called Ithaca SNR, and I want to spend a little bit of time explaining how I've come to this issue and give you some opening remarks before we hear from our panelists and get the discussion started. So for those who don't know what Ithaca SNR is, it is a not-for-profit research organization that focuses on issues related to higher education, particularly relating to information and technology access issues. I myself am an applied social science researcher, so I get to spend the bulk of my time researching how people do their research and their teaching towards making what is largely public outputs, openly available research outputs that are of value, especially to libraries, publishers, scholarly societies, and others in higher education. I come to this work very personally from a library background. I see myself as a librarian first and foremost, and it has really shaped all of the ways that I see the things going on in higher education and why I always personally try to focus on issues related to information and technology in everything I do in research for higher education. At Ithaca SNR, we have been studying the issue of open access as part of the work we do on scholarly communications for a very long time. Most notably, we have a US faculty survey that we send out every 3 years to faculty across the US. And we track issues related to how they discover and access information, other aspects of their research practices, scholarly communications, so the way that folks are publishing, how they view the publishing landscape, including open access, and teaching practices and their student needs. And the major perspective that I bring to the issue of open access is this evidence from Ithaca SNR. Having the opportunity to learn from faculty directly over decades about their perspective on scholarly communications is really where I start when I think about this issue. We also at Ithaca SNR do deep dives into research and teaching practices. So we have been tracking across a number of different fields how researchers and instructors approach issues related to discovering and accessing information. And as you can see here, over time, we've been able to get a very, very broad coverage because the reality is that how one approaches publishing or any aspect of the scholarly life cycle has an aspect to it that's really informed by one's disciplinary background, the topics that they work on, and their methodologies. I'd also like to acknowledge that in the research community that we're all a part of, that we come from very personal places when we think about open access. And this is something that the panelists today are all going to speak to, and we'll have an opportunity for everybody in the audience to reflect on for themselves. So I wanted to give you a few touch points from my personal experience beyond the research that I've done in a public facing way. So my first confession is that I am a founder of an independent open access journal, which in retrospect, is still quite remarkable to me, honestly. When I was a PhD student, several of my colleagues thought it would be a really fun and cool idea to start an open access journal. As you're probably telling by my tone, I can't believe we were so naive, because this was one of the hardest things I did during my time as a graduate student. This is a very idealistic publication. We wanted to be scholar-led. We wanted to have our own infrastructure. You can see that the design of the website, this is the current issue, is really beautiful, but that was done all on our own. There was a lot of resistance to even using the infrastructure of like the open journal system, for example, because it wasn't going to be nice looking enough. But what that really translated into was a lot of work for ourselves. It's something that I'm very proud of. The journal is part of the Radical Open Access Collective. So it is a recognition that this is a community, that this is a scholar-led publication. It's not for profit. It really captures a lot of the optimism and I think idealism of open access. However, at the exact same time that I was founding this journal, I also seemed to have no problem putting one of my own articles behind a paywall. It was very exciting for me around the same time to get published in Archival Science, one of the leading publications in my field. But when it came to having to pay the article processing charge, I couldn't do it. I didn't have the kind of external funding that would have allowed me to. I was at an institution that didn't have funding available for me at the time to cover the cost. And I was actually, frankly, kind of skeptical about the fact that I or anybody else should have to pay for open access. And as a grad student, I just really didn't have the energy to figure it out. So this is my way of saying that we can contain multitudes. People are confronting situations all the time where they could be in theory very, and in practice very supportive of different forms of open access and have challenges navigating them. One last example is another publication that came out from my work around the same time. It's technically available. You could get it today if you wanted to. However, I never entered into a licensing agreement with this journal to make the article open access. So it's what is known as bronze. It could be open access today, but maybe not tomorrow. For similar reasons, me and my co-author, who was the other founder of Feral Feminisms, didn't want to pay, couldn't pay. And it is available right now, but it wasn't due to anything we did, and we don't really have control in the future of the extent to which it will continue to be openly available. What I've learned over time from my research at Ithaca SNR is that my personal experience is not unusual. We do this survey every 3 years. The next one will be coming out for 2021. So the most recent available data we have is from 2018. And what we saw from that cycle is that while faculty are increasingly interested in an open access publication model, traditional scholarly incentives continue to motivate decision-making. We found that only 4 in 10 faculty indicated that the open access characteristics of journals were highly influential in their publication decisions. And again, this is reflected in my own experience. At the end of the day, publishing in GLQ, publishing in archival science, even if I didn't have the funds to make it open access, that was the priority when it came to my decision-making by far and large. I knew that this was what was going to get me rewards, such as for grant funding or other opportunities, and that's what I really focused on at the time. Now, that being said, you can only imagine how excited I am for the next cycle of the survey. 3 years is a long time in academia, and I cannot wait to see if the needle has been moved beyond 4 in 10 faculty, because the mandates for open access have only gotten stronger. There's more conversations being had about the kinds of costs or structural issues that would prevent people like me at the time, a junior scholar, from being able to make their content open access, or the burdens that come when you try to make your own open access journal for that matter. And I'm very happy to report that my co-founder, Ella, was actually able to translate her experiences in feral feminisms to getting a job at Illinois State in the English department in their publishing program. Another thing that is top of mind of me from the survey is the fact that 2/3 of respondents in the 2018 cycle indicated that they would be happy to see the subscription-based publication model replaced by an entirely open access system. So what this says to me is that there is a lot of interest and enthusiasm in the scholarly community about open access. And it really comes down to thinking through the most sustainable way to do these things, and that there's a lot of work still to be done. And so for the remainder of my talk, I really want to focus on these structural issues. Open Access Week is an international event from Spark. And the theme that they've set this year for Open Access Week is, it matters how we open knowledge. This, of course, is a recognition of the structural issues at play, that open access in and of itself only gets us so far as a concept, that we have to really attend to how it's done, and that there is an equity component to this. As Mark especially was emphasizing at the beginning today, there's a lot of reasons why open access matters. It is about recognizing that research and its outputs are public goods. It's about making content available to the widest audience possible, regardless of their purchasing power. And it's not just content in terms of articles, but other outputs and components of research as well, whether it be software, code, data. There's also the reality that there's huge value to governments, other funders, the public at large, because research is a public good. And finally, given that we're talking today in the context of SUNY, it's always important to recognize that open access has huge value for researchers and their institutions, not just for disseminating the knowledge that's produced, but also as a transparency mechanism and simply for impact. At the same time, there is a structure involved and there is a cost. In fact, I would argue that it's one of the most important things to attend to when it comes to open access is that with the growing demand that has come from the policy mandates, so too are opportunities for business to make money. And therefore, it really matters how we determine who shoulders the costs of open access, and who can profit off of it. Just to give you a sense of how I think about the costs, and this is, to me, is part of the how we open access. I kind of broke it down in terms of who's paying. So first is the example of article processing charges. That's something that researchers can pay. They may receive support from funders or their institutions, but not necessarily. Then we have universities. Universities pay too, in a variety of ways. One way that is especially top of mind to me is the maintenance of institutional repositories and providing staff support to help researchers navigate open access opportunities. There's also the reality that universities can pay publishers to cover a portion of open access costs, such as through transformative agreements with libraries. It's also important to think not just about the how we open access, but who the we is when we're opening access. So, there's a component of this that falls on the researchers themselves and those who fund them. Then there's the universities who are certainly funding that, but it's also important to acknowledge that behind every university is a government. Even private universities get public funding. And then finally are the libraries, which are technically a component of a university, but have such a strong role to play. And so it's important to call that out. So what's actually the matter? I propose three, but I think you could certainly come up with many more. The first is who pays and how much. Open access mandates are shifting scholarly communications costs from readers to authors. And in essence, open access is a market, but many have argued that the prices aren't competitive. There is research that shows, especially when it comes to article processing charges, that the value isn't necessarily set by market demand. And there are arguments that can be made that scholarly communications can't behave like a traditional market and that it doesn't make sense to set it up that way. To give you a couple of examples, the reality is that when you look at the motivations that scholars have, there isn't necessarily a lot of choice they have out there for where they publish. There are certain publications that are going to be the best fit for their research, and it doesn't really make sense for them to shop around. Which gets us to our next point. Part of the matter is thinking through who benefits or who we want to benefit from open access. The mandates are set in place to benefit readers both locally and globally who don't necessarily have purchasing power. And you could argue that readers may be too narrow of a term because there's other aspects to open access beyond articles. So maybe we call them consumers of research, users of research, the audience of research. However, there isn't a complete alignment yet in terms of how institutions reward their researchers and instructors. So in other words, the authors behind the content. And finally, part of what's the matter is what is made open. Open access goes far beyond peer-reviewed articles. And I think it can be especially challenging to navigate requirements for other research outputs. I'm thinking especially here of data and certain aspects of open educational resources. So here at SNR, what's up next for us is the 2021 edition of the Faculty Survey. And I want to highlight especially that we've added some additional questions about perspectives on scholarly outputs and especially open access models. So some of the things that we have questions about today, I'm hoping that we'll have some really exciting new data for next year. So now I'd like to turn the spotlight onto our panelists. The goal here is to have everyone have the opportunity on the panel to share a bit from their own perspective, similar to how I started off today, and then we'll move into a more freewheeling conversation. So just before we get started, for the panelists' sake, we're asking for a bit of an introduction, who you are, and how you came to the issue of open access. And if there's anything just at the beginning you want to especially highlight, either as some of the challenges you see facing open access from your perspective, or perhaps what role you think SUNY should be playing in the global open access movement. So we'll start with Gemma.
Thank you very much for those comments, Annie. Are really helpful. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion. I think it's a really interesting and important topic, especially as many of you have noted during Open Access Week this week. My name is Gemma Hersh, and I'm Senior Vice President for Global Research Solutions at Elsevier. I'm joining you from London, but my role is a global one. So I work with customers around the world to understand their needs on open access and open science. I'm actually responsible for our transformative agreements. So any agreements that include an open access or an open science component. I do also wear another hat. I have responsibility for our academic and government customers in Europe. So I get to see open access progression in perhaps one of the most mature markets in the open access space, but also that global vantage point of seeing what's happening in North America, in Asia Pacific. And I think it's fair to say that there are a real mixed set of views, Danielle, some of which you touched on, and that are reflected in the different degrees of open access uptake that we're seeing regionally. And I think it's fair to say that open access continues to grow at pace. That's certainly reflected in Elsevier's growth in open access articles, which is at about 50% CAGR over the last 10 years, a significant growth in open access articles. But nevertheless, the majority of articles, both for ourselves and across the market as a whole, continue to be published under the subscription model. Europe is definitely the furthest ahead. Most of our transformative agreements, most of our agreements with an open access component are in Europe. And if you look at where that split is between subscription and open access globally, China is around a 70-30 split in terms of subscription versus open access articles. The US is more like an 80-20 split. And I think there are lots of reasons for that difference in pace globally, which maybe touch on some of the challenges that I know you were keen for us to talk about, Danielle. I think there are different ways in which research is funded in Europe versus the US, for example, the more politicized nature of policies directing higher education, but also a difference in view in how directive or otherwise that libraries should be with authors on where and how they publish. And my observation is that certainly from a North America perspective, there's much more of a reluctance to get involved in, I guess, what's known as author choice, but also broader questions being asked about an APC-based model, the model that's typically associated with open access and what that means for equity. And to give a bit more color to those challenges, one of those is funding flows. Danielle, I think you touched on this a little bit as well, particularly the issue of, under the subscription model, the costs of publishing are spread among thousands of subscribers globally. When you move to an open access model, which at the moment is primarily dominated by an APC-based model, the cost shifts to paying to publish. Ergo, the more you publish, the more you pay. That represents a particular challenge for highly research-intensive institutions. And it means the funding flows that we have in place today in the ecosystem need to shift. It's a bit like global tax reform, which certainly makes my mind boggle. Then there's the point about author focus on open access and it not being a priority. Danielle, you showed some good data on this, and your own example, I think, really touches on that. Authors probably by and large all care about open access and think it's a good thing, but ultimately your primary focus is on where you want to publish and what business model you publish under doesn't always trump the decisions about the journal that you publish in, how you're funded and so on. I think finally, and this touches on the future a little bit, there's also much more of a discussion around what we're trying to achieve with open access and then what comes next. I think many of our customers, including those, in fact, in particular, those on transformative agreements, are thinking about what comes after open access, and perhaps more pointedly, whether open access alone can deliver the kinds of improvements in the research ecosystem that I think we all want to see. And what I mean by this is, I think we all want an even more transparent, even more collaborative, even more inclusive research ecosystem. Open access gets us some of the way there. Indeed, you could argue that open access is a prerequisite for what you would call open science. But open science is much bigger, much broader than open access to publications. It's about data, making data findable, accessible, interoperable. It's about replicating and interrogating research outcomes. It might even involve showcasing, collaboration, how you think about return on investment, how you think about funding opportunities. It's something that we're exploring in more detail in the Netherlands, where we have our first open science partnership. And I think it may signal where future discussions around this topic are really going to lie. In terms of where the role that SUNY can play, I think engendering discussions like this are really helpful. The more we get all stakeholders together talking about these issues, it certainly helps me and helps Elsevier think about how we can continue to partner with librarians, researchers, funders, institutions to deliver that kind of future I think we all want to see. I'll leave my opening remarks there. Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Let's move on to Jeff.
Okay, thank you. So let me just start by giving just the sort of briefest summary of my background here so people can get the context that I'm bringing in. I have an editorial relationship with 2 hybrid journals where I definitely hear from different authors about what kind of access they want and how they want to have supplemental materials and other things posted. I think probably more important was for 4 years, I was a president of an international scholarly society, the Association for Linguistic Typology. This is a scholarly society that has been associated with a journal. And there was a lot of discussion. It's a hybrid journal at the moment. And there was a lot of discussion among the membership about what it would take to bring the journal to full open access, sometimes contentious, sometimes more productive. And then the other thing, which is really going to color, I think, most of my remarks here, is I do a lot of my research is done in collaboration with scholars in Cameroon, working on, in particular, endangered and marginalized languages of Cameroon as well. So I'm interacting with these marginalized communities, also working with scholars who are not from those communities, but who themselves are sort of marginalized in the wider academic space. And I think when thinking about what I wanted to remark on here, I really wanted to think about the contrast between what I sense from my interactions with these Cameroonian scholars against a lot of the discussions and debates that I've heard primarily from Western scholars, say in a European and North American context around open access. And there were sort of 3 questions that came to my mind here that I think overlap quite a bit with the theme of this year's Open Access Week, which is what opening knowledge and building structural equity, as we just heard. The first one is, whose access are we talking about here? What is the nature of our audience for open access? And another one, and this came up a little bit as we just heard about what kinds of scholarship do we see as needing to be openly available? And that goes from the shift to open access to publishing, to open what is often called open science, but even open science, as I'll say in a minute, is quite a limited domain of scholarship in terms of what could be open. And then finally, who actually gets to decide what should or shouldn't be open? And here I think my perspective of working with maybe minority communities or marginalized communities is most central here. So let me just try to go through these and give some thoughts one by one. I think one of the things that struck me is most of the discussions I've seen around open access are among scholars in the global north. It's international, but it's very much governed by Australia, Canada, US, and Europe. And these scholars are really considering those issues. And mostly they're concerned with who will pay for their articles and how will their articles get out there. But there's really a lot more issues to access than this, because the even gold standard open access assumes, I think, at least 2 critical things that's lacking for most of the world. One is a high-speed internet connection, and 2 is good knowledge of academic English in particular. And the question is, how, if we really want everyone to have access to knowledge, what are we doing to make sure those without good internet connections have access to that knowledge? And even on the English side, as global academic English takes over, are there steps we could take to even increase accessibility that doesn't involve full translation? If you go back to, I think, the 80s and 90s, even into the 2000s, I can think of a lot of linguistics journals in Europe where if an article was in English, the abstracts were also had to be in French and maybe German. We're not really doing that anymore, but I'm not sure why we aren't trying to at least have abstracts or titles or even keywords in Mandarin or Arabic. I don't think the German scholars need German as much as they used to. They all are learning English, but there's still billions of people who might need some other language, but I don't see a lot of discussion around that. So I think the discussions have really been sort of global north focused and not really thinking about opening up the audience to those things. And in that sense, I think gold standard open access is kind of a bit of a misnomer. I think it's still only giving access to a tiny sliver of the entire world. The next thing is, what do we mean by, like, what should be open when we sort of consider open access as well here? And even talking about open science, what I hear is code and data sets. I don't hear the email conversations that go around informally that shape what we choose to research in the first place. I don't hear about how the choice is made of what we should publish. Anyone who does scholarship knows that there's lots of dead ends. We don't publicize those very much. We don't really talk about how trends to the public, we do this internally as scholars, but how our internal trends, our funding mechanisms, prestige and other outcomes are actually shaping what does and doesn't get talked about. And what I want to emphasize here is that scholars still have this tremendous role as gatekeepers when it comes to openness. We really decide what goes out there. Very often I've heard scholars sort of portray, say, Elsevier or Springer as having this gatekeeper role, but they only get to restrict or open access to that small sliver of items that we actually give to them as publishers to publish. And we don't really ask how much of what we do should or should not be open to the public. There's a balance there. Too much openness can cause a lot of problems, but I don't know that we ourselves have really reflected on our role as gatekeepers to the knowledge that we're producing. And then the final thing that I want to think here is about who decides what should and shouldn't be open and who are the diverse communities there. One thing when I talk here about open access, I think we generally appeal to a kind of a vague, maybe almost enlightenment notion of a broad research public and a broad set of sort of international scholars, but we aren't really thinking about minority and marginalized communities or even the general public. There's some science that the general public may prefer not to be open, like how to add a function, like gain of function research for viruses. I'm not sure the general public wants us to make that as open as possible. Maybe we should or shouldn't. But as scholars, we have, or at least Western scholars, have a very particular value set around openness and a sort of a broad general public, which may not be shared by the entire world. And I think it would be interesting to hear what they have to say. And where I really know this more directly is working with, say, indigenous communities who may want scholars to do research on their communities, but may have very good reasons for that not to be open. And I think it would be interesting to sort of foster those discussions and figure out where those limits are. I know I would like to sort of follow a lot of their value systems if I know what those are. I hear about that sometimes from North American communities, but the various, say, African indigenous communities I work with aren't even able to engage in those discussions. So I'm wondering, how do we get a better sense of what they would like to see in terms of openness? So I'll stop there. Those are my thoughts on this. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Evviva, perhaps you'd be willing to share next.
Sure, thanks, Danielle. As I was introduced earlier, I'm Evviva Weinraub Lajoie. I'm the Vice Provost of University Libraries at the University at Buffalo, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I come to this discussion from, I would argue, a much more infrastructure-based background. So open access is, of course, something that's been part of my career and something that I'm interested in and thoughtful about. But most of my background really comes in from building the networks and the systems that allow for research to be shared and presented through digital formats. So a lot of my thought and sort of thought processes go into how we're creating the systems that actually allow for data transfer and for open sharing across those networks. So Jeff, you brought up a couple of points that I thought were actually really valuable. Certainly when we talk about, you brought up the idea of sort of the white Western perspective on access sort of generally, or open generally. And I think that what you're describing for me is kind of one of the underlying sort of structural issues that we have when we talk about a global, sort of globally being able to share information equitably across boundaries. And so some of that can be solved by permissions and things like that within the infrastructure itself. But I think more broadly, when I think about how we're supporting or not supporting open access and sort of open information sharing more generally, some of the things I think about are really kind of predicated on the idea that we are that we really need to try to think very differently about how these things are structured from the get-go, and we have not really, I think, done a very good job of that. When I look at the communities that are supporting this kind of open work, and I come up from those communities, and I love many aspects of those communities, but they are still predicated on white Western structures, which look at things like meritocracy as being, the kind of underlying structure of how we're deciding what gets elevated and what doesn't. And I think that can cause some real problems for us, and certainly sort of exacerbates our issues with funding, right? So when we talk about open access in a global context, right, we in the United States have a hard time finding a peer group to look at, right? Because we are not like the Netherlands. We cannot negotiate with Elsevier as a single group. We in SUNY are able to negotiate with publishers in one way or another, but we are struggling with the ability to really look at somebody else. And so when we talk about our own structures here, when I think about what it would take for us to build a national research data network or any kind of requirements that our faculty or that our researchers would have regarding publishing and how we're presenting their data, we're having a really hard time even kind of starting some of those conversations because we're having a hard time thinking about how to fund it, how to structure it, who's going to pay for it, how are we going to be part of the decision-making process of paying for it. And I think, we have a number of different kinds of pieces that are in play here. I think the other piece that I also keep thinking about, and this has been coming to me, I think a little bit more kind of over time, right? We've been looking at faculty publishing in things like Scalar or these sort of very different ways of presenting their research information as part of their, their dossier for tenure. And we are also kind of starting to see more and more people presenting their research findings in things like Jupyter notebooks, right? So how are we supporting that in the long term? How are we presenting and preserving those as part of the research output that's being created? And I think we are in this kind of very liminal space where we don't really have the right infrastructure. We don't really have the right governance. And we're hearing a desire for this, but we're struggling with how we're actually going to structure it and pay for it. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Evviva. And last but not least, Diana.
Yes, good morning, and thanks for inviting me to join this discussion. So I'm here with two hats. As an author, I direct a large research group here at the chemistry department, and we publish a lot of papers. And also I'm wearing a hat of an editor. I'm an editor of the Journal of Hazardous Material, which is an international journal from Elsevier. So as an author, I'm actually with you, Danielle. I don't like to pay for the APC. So I avoid open access because I hate to pay $3,000 to publish. So really the whole time I've been here, I only look for impact factor. So when I select journal, I look at the impact of the journal and the how it is relevant to what I do, to the research. But ironically, as an editor, I was actually recently charged by my publisher to open or to initiate a new open access journal, which is the sister journal of hazardous materials, and it's only open access. It's called the Hazardous Materials Letters. So that I actually had to struggle with that because the APC charge is quite high. Although one way to do that to encourage, so how do you encourage authors to publish in a journal that charges but has no impact factor? So the way to do it is to make the APC free for the first 24 months. And then after that, we actually encourage, also we invite people who are well-known, and we also waive those fee for well-known authors. It's kind of like one way to advertise your new journal. And the other thing about things about equity that was touched earlier, in this journal that I started, that's an open access, you can apply for a waiver if you are from a developing country. And there's a tier, like if it's, I think you can get a 50% discount, but you could also justify to completely waive the, like if you're a sole author from a developing country, you can waive your fee completely. But maybe sometimes, I mean, now there's a lot of collaboration. So if you have a collaborator from, a Western world, then maybe it's only a discount. So there's some stages of fees for that. So having said that, I do have open access publications. And when I look at this discussion, I was thinking, like, when did I decide to have an open access? Well, first of all, I was looking at my open access publications, they're all waived because it was an invited paper. And there's only one time that I actually paid. It was because I didn't realize that the journal moved to an open access. So when I submitted that, it's a very good journal, and we normally publish there. So we submitted our paper, and then I didn't look that they actually changed it. Now it's open access, and now you have to pay. So I ended up paying. But in general, I would not, it wouldn't be my first choice to publish an open access journal if I have to pay. One last comment, I kind of wanted to answer. There's a question about if SUNY provides APC. I remember when I just started at UB 18 years ago, there was in UB, there was as an assistant professor, you can apply for a publication grant. I think it's up to $5,000. So they would pay for open access publication. It disappeared. I think budget cuts. I don't think it exists now, but it's something that I actually just thought about. You know, I'm also the director of Renew. It's a Renew Institute here at UB. I am actually thinking that maybe it's a good idea to provide funding to our Renew affiliate faculty to cover for charges for open access, because that also increases the, one of the things that we would like is, of course, improve our visibility. And one way to improve visibility is to have publications that are open access. And last thing I want to say, as that might be relevant to this, in the Journal of Hazardous Material, which is normally not an open access, we have had virtual issues. Whereas editor, I picked 50 like really good papers from top authors, well-known authors, to make it open access for a year. So we had this virtual issue that's with selected papers. And part of the motivation for that, which something that I thought about as an editor, how to improve the impact factor of the journal, and it did. So by putting 50 articles as an open access that's already been published for 1 year, it improved our impact factor significantly. So that's some strategy that as an editor we make. We also did that during the COVID, where we selected a lot of COVID related articles and made it open access for a year. That one was not profit motivated. It's more to make it accessible to a lot of people who are doing COVID research during, which is during the pandemic. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. And to everybody, as you can see, the panel was so thoughtfully constructed so that we'd have a really nice diversity of perspectives and experiences with open access. And I'd like to propose that we start the discussion going back to a question that Mark had, which was, what is real progress? We've all been reflecting on the panel about the various types of ways you can think about progress in terms of open access, either whether the vantage be very local or from the experience as an individual researcher, all the way to global considerations and the reality that what progress may mean in the global north doesn't necessarily translate to what makes sense when you think beyond that framing. And so given that this is a SUNY event and that many folks on the panel have a very explicit tie to the SUNY community, I thought it'd be nice to start with the question of what is real progress from the vantage of SUNY, from your perspective, given that there's so many complexities to how an institution like SUNY can navigate the issue of open access, and that progress sometimes can be very incremental. When you think about SUNY as an institution and what it can do and how it could possibly foster open access, what do you think, what would be real progress for SUNY in terms of open access? And just to make things equitable, I won't call on the same person first every time. So I think I'm going to put Evviva on the spot because, you you recognize yourself that you're especially always thinking about infrastructure and a systems perspective. So I feel like your mindset is kind of always very much on this vantage.
Yeah, okay. So this is a tough one for me because I think that there are a couple of ways that we could approach this. I think certainly, we could and again, recognizing that UB is not necessarily representative, and in fact is not representative of the entirety of SUNY or what the entirety of SUNY looks like. But from my perspective, I think, you know, we can continue to engage in these kinds of discussions. I think that continues to be valuable for us. I think for me, one of the big things that I think about is actually our research data infrastructure, and what we're doing to preserve and present what is being created here. We have a limited ability currently to be able to support the clinical and research data needs of our faculty and researchers on UB's campus, and I think within SUNY more generally. And I would love for us to have some sort of better research data infrastructure to be able to share information more readily and easily. That for me, I think would be a success. And I think it would also be something that does not really exist anywhere else within a system structure. So for me, that is really kind of where what I sort of see as something that would be a really great accomplishment for us. What that looks like and how that plays out, I think in a more local context, I think is going to be a kind of an interesting part of this conversation. But the other piece of it for me, I think, is really around how we're paying for these things and whether or not we want to pay for things like transformative agreements within SUNY itself. I think that you know, Gemma mentioned this, and it's, I think, a pretty major bone of contention in the North American space, that there are some real equity concerns that exist within the current transformative agreement model that I think are of concern to many within the library community around equity for our researchers in the longer term. And I think we have some opportunities here to decide whether or not, as a collective faculty, how we feel about and whether or not we as a sort of collective organization want to engage in these kinds of transformative agreements as part of our license agreement work.
Jeff, maybe I'll put you on the spot next. What do you think would be real progress for SUNY in terms of open access?
I think so. Two things came to mind. One of them was kind of anticipated very much by what Evviva just said. So if I have my Global North Scholar hat on, and I just think selfishly, certainly research data infrastructure. And I think there's even some low-hanging fruit there, where at least at Buffalo at the moment, and I think this is true of most of North America, so I don't actually want to critique UB, I want to compare it to Europe again. When I go to the, say, websites of a lot of European scholars, clearly their institutions have a process through which they're collecting information on what publications those scholars are producing, and they're finding a way to systematically update it from year to year. And it's, I know some of these scholars well, these linguists. I know they're not updating their websites on their own. I just know these are not who those people are. But clearly, institutionally, they've made this commitment, and wherever possible, there is direct access to whatever version of those papers can be legally made available. So whether it's gold or preprint or something like this. And then I always think every year around May, I have to fill out a faculty report form about my research activities to my dean. So there's this moment when I'm collecting all the information on everything I'm doing, but nothing is happening beyond, as far as I can tell, my own College of Arts and Sciences. And I think this is a missed opportunity. So this is the low-hanging fruit, and I think it ties into research data infrastructure. We as faculty have to report what we're doing. Can we streamline that so that that becomes more public or publicized via our websites, via some standardized form? And then maybe if the libraries could help with the working out which copies of our research can and cannot be made legally public. So if they know, hey, this journal allows you to do, after 12 months, put up the final version of your paper, hey, let me know, and then either they could find it for me or I could supply it, but sort of facilitating that process so that all of this SUNY research that can be legally open is facilitated to be made open. So right now, the thing I just feel like there's a lot of friction in that process. And I always feel like I hate having to enter the same data twice to my own institution. And is there some way to actually streamline that? And I imagine that could scale to SUNY on some level, definitely within UB, but everyone has to report on what they're doing. And why aren't we using that moment more efficiently? The other thing I wonder, this is not something I've done as concretely, so this is trying to be a little more broad-based, is I actually would be curious to know what the residents of the state of New York want from us. I don't know, as an institution, are librarians or is SUNY actually asking, and maybe CUNY as well, what information do they want the universities to provide them? What do they want to see from the researchers? Do they want us to do, when I have NSF in the last National Science Foundation in the last few years, when you close out a grant, you have to do a 1-paragraph public summary of what work you did, public facing. Now, I don't want to assign myself more work and say that for all of my published papers, I have to do a public summary of what I'm doing. But I guess I would like to know what they would like to see to make sure that either they have access to the information they need, or so they understand why they're supporting research at the SUNY level. And maybe I'd ignore the recommendations. I'm not saying I would do them, but I would at least like to know what they want, at least as a starting point.
That's a really fascinating proposal, Jeff. I've never quite thought about it that way. I feel like we may want to dig into that one a bit further as we continue with the panel. Diana, what do you see as where real progress could be for SUNY specifically?
Well, I think just going back to my comment earlier, just a simple thing about supporting researchers for open access to pay for APC. I think that would help a lot, especially so UB has this aspiration to be top 25 public university. I think that would help a lot with the visibility of the researchers here, if they can afford to make their papers be open access, because it's quite contradictory actually. So I sit in the promotion and tenure committee for the CAS, and we joke that we just know how to count. We count how many publications you have, and we count how many people cited your publication. But they're actually contradictory, because if you are only doing open access, then you're limited because you can only afford so many. So that's low count. But then if you count the citations, the most citations you get are the ones that are open access. So if you could make those together, then that would be a good formula.
And finally, Gemma?
I guess for me, I'm going to give more of a service provider perspective. And listening to the discussion here, particularly Evviva's comments, one size does not fit all. And that is true of every agreement that we reach. It is a very strong factor in why we carefully talk about our transformative agreements as pilots, because they are all genuinely uniquely crafted based on what that individual institution or individual consortia is trying to achieve. And that can be, just to give you a sense of that range of things, we have some customers that want to centralize open access. We have others that very much want to decentralize open access. We have some customers that are looking to learn and understand more about researcher behavior. We have some customers who see open access as a success for them if they grow in increments of 10 or 20% OA over time. We have others who have an end goal of 100%. We have some customers who are focused on looking at open access, to Jeff's point, in specific disciplines or in specific quality fields. So really, it's for us about understanding all of those nuances, all of those different needs, and working out how we can best service all of those individual needs, which gets very, very complicated in a global landscape. But I think this discussion kind of highlights why that's very much needed.
So as I indicated before, I think Jeff brought up a very intriguing point, this idea that, there is also the public's perspective on open access and how we feed that into the priorities for how something is made open. And Gemma especially has shown us how these considerations can really vary based on where you are globally and how input from the public or the participation of the public is viewed. And, here in the US, we have some very particular perspectives on the extent to which the public should support things, where their input should be. Some of us may even be scarred from being overly, maybe the democracy or not at work, and the threats that have been to that. And one could actually maybe be afraid of what would happen if we let the public have more of a say. And I'm saying this as a Canadian living in America, full disclosure. But I was wondering if anybody else wanted to weigh in about this idea of how we should, get the input from New York State residents, the extent to which, a state like New York should be forging its own path, given the way the government is organized in America, which is interesting. Any other thoughts on that, and including, similar to what Jeff was saying, kind of reflecting on what it means to be an individual trying to articulate that, or more systematically? Any other thoughts or visceral reactions? Evviva.
So I don't know that I necessarily have an idea about how we could get New York State residents' input, though I'm really intrigued by the sort of thought about how we might do something like that. But I am struck, I think, by looking at projects like Merkutu, which is a Drupal-based repository solution that basically centers it was primarily created with indigenous communities, and is primarily used in that space to provide either the communities themselves or researchers access to materials in a way that allows the community to sort of control who has access to particular objects and when they have access to those objects. And certainly more and more of the infrastructure that we're creating has that kind of permission structure built into it, or if it doesn't have it, it's available to be able to work into it. So I think from a technical perspective, we can probably meet some of these requirements or suggestions, and can be pretty granular about what would be accessible when. I think obviously that is a sort of a high touch human point of contact conversation, which, as we know, can be difficult to scale because it can be expensive unless you're working with the researcher to figure out what would make the most sense. And so I'm sort of on the technical side. I think it's something that we can work through. I am intrigued by your thought, Jeff. I think, we do this sort of process when we're talking about how do we build something, right? How do we get the user's perspective? How do we make sure that they're involved in this? And I don't really know kind of where to go from there, but I am intrigued by the concept of kind of how much information and what kind of information do people really want.
Diana, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am conscious that given that from your disciplinary background in chemistry and also just in the materials world in general, there's often collaborations that would be taking place with industry, and that is a different kind of working with, a community that like we've been talking about several different kinds of communities that aren't traditionally with or squarely within academia. But including just the general public. But I was wondering if there's anything more you could share about what it's like being in a field where there are times where you can't even share information for proprietary reasons, and that's actually a really important part of the work that's being done.
Right. So actually just looking in the chemistry department, so we have sometimes students who graduate PhD without any publications because they're working with industry and they cannot publish their results. I don't know if that answers your question, but we have a lot of those cases where you're not even allowed to publish anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think, especially that I know SUNY has, as a major priority of being, a public institution, also being a catalyst point around industry, especially locally. So sometimes one could wonder if the ethos of everything open, default to open, doesn't always work even for that context, which I think is important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, there are industries who actually encourage. I worked for industry before I came to UB, and we were encouraged to publish. But before you can publish, you have to go through a lot of things to make sure you're not publishing anything proprietary. So there's limitations to what you can publish. So I think it is encouraged. There's just a lot of limitations.
Yeah, and even if you get to the endpoint, the time scale could be totally different, which again then leads to challenges when you're reviewing someone's package for promotion, or if somebody's on the job market when we're thinking of grad students. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, because you mentioned something and I thought about it earlier about reviewing for tenure. So we were discussing about maybe like making your information from research publicly available to also in formats like in magazines that are like popular magazines that are not really scientifically rigorously reviewed, and also written in the level that the general public can understand. Especially for my work, I do a lot of environmental chemistry, looking at pollution, and a lot of people that are not chemists would be interested in what I do. So once in a while, I get invited by a magazine that features our work, and it's written in a way that, people who are non-scientific can understand it. It actually gets a lot of, it reaches a lot of people, but it doesn't count in the tenure. So there's this disconnect, right? When we look at the tenure package and they see, oh, I published in this magazine, a Buffalo News or something, it doesn't count. So I think there has to be some kind of a change also in the mindset of how we judge people's work to accommodate these types of almost an outreach to publications.
And I think, Gemma especially was pushing us in that direction in her opening remarks, which were really about what is beyond open access. What does it mean to be open science or open research? That simply just making an article accessible in and of itself is one step in a process, but it can't be the end point necessarily. I'll give one more example, which is that at some points in this panel, we've been reflecting on the COVID-19 era and the reality that having certain kinds of open data and open outputs, especially from preprint servers, was important for scholarly activity. But the flip side is that it actually led to a lot of misinformation amongst the general public. And so, as Diana's saying, open research isn't just about making articles available, but there are other ways to produce outputs that reach a wider audience that is done in a way that is especially productive for communicating what's significant from the findings. And there's many different ways that one can communicate, not just having one genre or format isn't going to work for every audience. And that's a really powerful point. So maybe taking that one step further, Gemma, I'd love to have you reflect a little bit further on this idea that it's not just about open access, but also open science, especially as Jeff was pushing us to go even further, perhaps, to open research, and anything that you've been especially thinking through or navigating there to really make progress in that direction.
Sure. And maybe just to take your comment just now about the debate in this space about openness and who reads what articles and what versions and how you signpost. I think the debate around preprints, for example, really exemplifies much of what you're saying. There is one school of thought that having early research as open and visible and available as quickly as possible can do so much to help particularly those at early stages working on similar things, just to get things out in the ether. It's another marker of research. Diana, to your point, there isn't just one size fits all of research either. It comes in lots of forms. But then on the other hand, how do you balance that against the process by which we do science and the way in which research progresses to be validated and sense checked and peer reviewed and so on, so that people have that quality, not just quality, but verifiable science that they know is stacking up. So I think that's a really interesting debate. In the open science space, I think what we're hearing from certainly those we speak to is, again, open access is a really important component. I think in whatever form it takes, More articles will continue to be made openly available, and I think that's a good thing. But different institutions, again, have different priorities in terms of what they're looking to achieve. Some are really focused on how to aggregate information centrally and understand and have visibility of what's happening in their institution. How do they make decisions about funding? How do they make decisions about how they can attract the best talent? How they can connect to researchers working on interdisciplinary research? And that takes you down one path. There is also a view or a set of institutions that want to focus on actually collaboration with the private sector. And how do you find experts? How do you facilitate those kinds of collaborations? And the solutions might take you down a different path. Then there's a general banner of open science where people conceptualize the next frontier as being about data. But again, there's so many different components to that. Are researchers sharing their data? If so, where? How is that stored? How's that managed at the institution? What format is it in? How do I know where to look for it? Very similar topics that we've been discussing around open access as well. So I think we really are at the very, very beginning of a discussion on open science, which is funny because some in Europe would argue that we've been having that discussion for a number of years now, but I don't think we've managed to progress it beyond the conceptual. We think open science is a good thing. It's these pillars that make up open science, but the challenge is what they actually mean in detail and practice and how we get there.
And you could also argue, I mean, maybe part of the reason why Europe would say we've been talking about this for a long time, Gemma, is because they're really, I would argue that that's really the region that pushed the narrative in the direction of open science and now open research in the first place, which is really fascinating. I'm also conscious of the fact that we've spent the bulk of our time today talking about research, whether it be science, whether it be access, but of course at SUNY, a huge priority is around teaching and open educational resources. And I'm also very conscious of the time. It's 11:17 and we're supposed to end at 11:30. So I think this would be a nice moment to just have everybody, reflecting on the panel conversation we've had today, all the things that came up. Is there something that you think that actually it was missing from this conversation that you want to punch up further? Whether it be teaching is one example, but there could be others, or and if not, if there's one takeaway that you really want to amplify from what we discussed today or what you've been reflecting from your vantage. And Diana, I'll start with you.
About teaching, actually, I'm not teaching anymore because I'm a director of an institute. But during the pandemic, and I don't know if this is relevant, I did a lot of teaching, volunteer teaching for Philippines because they didn't have a lot of, for chemistry, like virtual chemistry labs. So I think a lot of us, because I'm originally from the Philippines, there were a lot of Filipino faculty in the US who have access to really better tools for teaching labs in chemistry, which is very challenging. So a lot of us volunteered to help out university in the Philippines. It's like an open university. And I thought that was like something that could be done even more normally, even after the pandemic, to share knowledge, advanced knowledge, and that we could do to other developing countries.
I think we could probably have a whole other session just on that experience alone. That is so fascinating and exciting. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit more detail about what kinds of resources you would use when you're teaching students in an open context like this. I'm conscious that chemistry often involves things like labs and experiments.
Yeah, there's actually, I can't remember now. They have a lot of videos already made. Normally you pay for it. Publishing, I can't remember the publisher, but they have a lot of like experiments for, if you just say, I want an experiment in spectroscopy, they have a whole hour of that with videos and like step by step. And it's very expensive to subscribe to that. But because of the pandemic, a lot of these publishers made it available freely to UB faculty. So then I could also share it with my colleagues in the Philippines. I think I saw Amanda McCullough somewhere. She probably knows what I'm talking about. I can't remember.
And Diana, and on certain levels, we all know what you're talking about. There was so much content that was made available
Yeah.
in the pandemic. And then the question becomes, now we've all gotten used to that. Do we want to go back? Can we go back? That you've just given such a powerful example of what can be activated when you have that available, because it's true. There's some really interesting publishers,
Yeah.
Vendors, societies that have videos available. One example, Dove.
Actually, if I could add, so before we shut down completely, we were allowed to be in the lab. So I had all my teaching assistants do the experiments, and somebody was videoing it. It's unprofessionally done, but well done actually by my students. They're so, very good in technology. They created all the videos of the experiments we were going to do for the rest of the semester and made it available to the students enrolled. And those are not copyrighted, so I can just share it with people who might want it.
That's incredible.
And a lot of other universities did the same thing.
Jeff, do you want to maybe go next?
Yeah, I was actually thinking, I didn't bring it up in my earlier discussions about some of my own COVID teaching experience didn't center as much on UB, in part because my teaching load, I'm doing some teaching, but as chair, my teaching load is reduced. But it did get us thinking, because we try to do a lot of collaborative work, research in Cameroon to get the research going, where we work with Cameroonian students to do some of the linguistic research. And we had a model where, and we already knew it was failing, a kind of in-person training model where people would fly in for 2 weeks, do a workshop. That was really good for building community, and it was really critical to have that contact like that. But we needed to be able to give students like refresher courses and other things, and also push out new ideas in between these major workshops. And obviously during the pandemic, we were thinking harder about this because international travel wasn't possible, but work could still go on in Cameroon. How do we keep all of these things going? And I think what I'll say is a lot of my earlier remarks were shaped by this, because there are all these great online teaching platforms and online videos, but we really had to think about, and we're still working on this project now, Chris Hollister is part of this with me too, how do you actually have open educational resources in sporadic network environments? And one of the things we kept hearing from the Cameroonian students is sort of the importance of being able to log on, download an entire course as a PDF, for example. They may even want to print it out if they could, because they sort of live in an environment of precarity. And I don't think this is just purely a developing country thing. I think there are actually probably a lot of people, say in rural parts of the US, or people with sporadic internet access, who would really value a course platform. So I'll say no course platform that I can find is designed to be multilingual from the start. So I'm going to put that aside as they're just not supported. That's because of the US dominance. We're basically a monolingual, well, we are ideologically monolingual, and that just falls out through all software development. The EU is obviously better in this regard. But then they just really, since they live in a world of sort of precarity, the idea that I can log into this course and I can log in the next week or the week after, it doesn't exist for them. They want to be able to say, hey, look, I have access to this course now. Let me download all of it, read it at my leisure, and then maybe I can go back and online and get the updates. But we really noticed how this wasn't set up. We did discover there are groups like Internet in a Box, various NGOs that are trying to support this space. But that's just how I was thinking about from sort of Diana's remarks, how much the pandemic got us thinking about what we could do remotely, but we had to assume a not online all the time environment. And then I'll finish with this one additional observation, which is that even though we have this perception, I believe, that, oh, eventually the internet will be high speed and get everywhere. But we've also seen in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, we saw it in Cameroon, but we've seen it in India now, we've seen it in Egypt. Periodically, states have decided that it's to their advantage to cut off internet access to their various parts of their country. And we see this again and again. We also know that there are countries that limit internet access. So the idea of actually, now you can think of a scholar or a teacher or a student, maybe they're abroad for a conference and they want to be able to get all of that content at once while they can do it, because it may not, in 10 or 20 years, it may not be a matter of having high-speed bandwidth. It may literally be a matter of your government has just cut off your access to knowledge, and what structures do we need to support them kind of, I hate to say smuggling knowledge back in, but I think unfortunately we're moving to that world, and that seems to just be increasing. So my earlier remarks were sort of shaped by that understanding of what people in these sort of situations of precarity and how their relationship to knowledge and how important it is for them not to be on the web, but to have versions that they view as more permanent than a website.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Gemma.
Hey, oh, I'm sorry,
Mark?
Danielle.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah, there was a couple questions that were they're floating out there, and I just want to make sure they get addressed before we completely walk away. Okay. So one question that came in, and it was sent in a private message to me, which I think is interesting, and it's probably going to be directed to Gemma. Gemma, in European negotiations with your employer, Elsevier, who typically sits at the negotiation table? You know, in the US, it's typically libraries that sit at the negotiation table. Occasionally, we flavor it with a faculty member, maybe a vice president of research or two will eventually come in to the discussion. But you know, the question was, you know, they were curious to find out who sits at the actual negotiation table in the European Union.
Yeah, it's the same globally, really. Librarians primarily. So we are negotiating with, discussing with librarians. Often in Europe, we're quite heavily dominated by consortia by virtue of the countries being quite small. So you'll typically have consortia representatives or the negotiating body done through the consortia, but librarians part of that discussion or part of the negotiating team. So I think a very similar setup to what you would be familiar with.
All right, thank you very much. And then there was a question that also came in from my colleague, Phil Ortiz. Phil, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, Mark. So I serve as an editor of a discipline-based education research journal, and we try to ascribe to open access practices, but open access, as you know, is expensive, and that makes it prohibitive for many people, especially DBER folks who tend to be funded on the lower end of the spectrum, also face an ongoing question about where to publish their research. If they're spending money on publishing DBER, they're not going to have the money to publish their primary focus research. So let's say it's a chemist and they're doing chemistry research and also doing some DBER on the side. Given the choice, they're probably going to publish towards their primary, not their discipline, not their DBER. So I think, you know, I think there are some ongoing questions and challenges associated with DBR, and I'd like to see those discussed. And as an editor, one of my primary questions is, it seems to me that open access saves libraries a lot of money. It would be wonderful if some of that money was directed back towards faculty so that they could use those funds to pay the open access fees. So maybe that could be my question.
And maybe just for the efficiency, Evviva, we'll put you on the spot. You can get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say this: open access doesn't actually save libraries that much money. In fact, I think that is one of the sort of misnomers of open access. It's what we're actually seeing is that our costs are shifting to sort of other areas that we need to support that are around basically making research accessible to our faculty, students, and other researchers. The model that you're talking about, which is effectively you know, an APC coming from the libraries, is something that many libraries have done for quite some time. And I personally think it's a model that is not really going to work here. I think in the long run for us, because fundamentally speaking, the library should not be responsible for the publication of research, which is where those APC costs are. And what we are finding is that we are still in fact paying on the other side for things, even if a journal is open. So I think we can, I think there are ways we can explore this, but I think that basically reallocating the library's budget to cover the publication of research is not a sustainable model for us either.
Well, Mark and Chris, maybe I'll turn it over to the housekeepers.
Mark, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will go first. I just want to say thank you to the panelists. Chris, I'll leave it to you if you want to try to sneak one more question in. You're the host campus.
Yeah, so I wouldn't even know where to begin with the questions. This has been such a compelling conversation. So I'll just do the same thing as you, Mark. I'm going to thank Danielle and our remarkable panelists for this wonderful discussion that was exactly what I hoped, and I think Mark had hoped it would be, which is kind of moving the needle on the open access discussion. I'm really grateful to everybody who shared some of their valuable time with us this morning, and just super grateful to Danielle and these remarkable panelists. Thank you so much.